Oh.
Welcome to the Threat Management Office Hours. We're going to quickly summarize what the original question was. Alexander, can you restate your question for the video?
Matt actually did a better job of summarizing what
Matt,
the
will you
question was.
restate Alexander's
I
question for Alexander for the video?
Sure. So Alexander was asking about having vulnerabilities created from potentially from alerts, and then also how that could fit in with some of the policy management stuff. And I think I'm a little less clear about alerts. I think Sam and I have kind of talked about this, but that's more stuff that's happening in production on the infrastructure side. It may make sense to convert some alerts into a vulnerability if it's something for an internal team to address or patch something. I see a more or a stronger use case for the policy piece, which I think Sam is about to give us a demo of, and it'll make a little bit more sense once you see it. But because it's sort of a generalized rules builder, I think it would be great for setting up things like, for example, today we've got the vulnerability check rule or the security approval gate, whatever you want to call it. It's kind of just a 1 or a 0. It's on or it's off. If it's on, it enforces any critical, high, or unknown vulnerabilities are blocked from being merged without an approval. That's great, but it's not really flexible, right? Like, what if for a particular project I only care about criticals? What if I don't care about highs from a particular scanner that I know is noisy, right? So using something like what Sam's got with a policy builder, you could construct those very specific kind of, I guess, logic rules and use those to enforce different things for the vulnerability management workflows. And ideally, we could do it at a group level so you wouldn't have to go into each individual project. You could just set a policy for something like that top down and then override at the project level. Oh, Sam, you're on mute. Sam, you're on mute.
There we go. Is that better? So we don't have everything that Matt talked about in this prototype, but we do have some things. So we created this new vulnerability management policy type, and that lets you write some rules around some of the actions that users can take. So if you want to actually prevent users from ever dismissing vulnerabilities, you could do that. You could potentially extend this out to add some additional criteria, or have this say, allow the action but require a comment. You could also write some rules around when vulnerabilities change severity, so that you could either allow or prevent users from changing that severity, or provide a comment if they decided to upgrade or downgrade the severity of vulnerability. So we don't have, like I said, we don't have everything that Matt talked about. I think some of that other stuff would probably come in your scan results policy, where you say, if dependency scanning finds one or more critical vulnerabilities, you might have an action down here that says, ignore that, don't generate the vulnerability. Just, we don't really care about, whatever this may be. So this, if this then that logic is definitely highly extensible, so we can have that flexibility to adjust this as needed depending on our users' needs in the future.
That's super cool. That's it.
So Alexander, when are you going to have that done, since you work on that now?
Yeah, that's next. That's just, I'm just finishing up some things, and then, next year.
Which is in 16 days?
Yeah, Q2, end of Q3 or something.
With a Q. So one thing I do want to make sure to call attention to is when Sam was kind of showing this to me, he basically said, and Sam, tell me this is incorrect, the behaviors, so that was just a prototype, and Sam has graciously added things to his prototype for vulnerability management specifically, but you can almost think of everything from that top level drop down setting, like the scanners and the vulnerability management, as like a module. So we would have the ability to do kind of whatever we would need in terms of our rule sets. We're just leveraging that awesome UI and the kind of the if then else logic on that. A lot of stuff to figure out, like how do we store that? Obviously doing that in a YAML based config probably doesn't make any sense, especially not for a group top down kind of a policy piece, and especially for things that aren't going to necessarily rely on a pipeline. Like if I want to make a rule, for instance, that says dismissals require an approval before I do that. If that's on a vulnerability report, like project level thing, why would I put that in a YAML file, right? I should be able to turn that on and off without triggering a pipeline. So quite a ways out, but I think that's a really, really good direction to sort of point at for that kind of stuff in the future.
I have a minor remark or question that would be super useful to me personally in the SecAuto team. And is that, and also as former part of the security operations team, we sometimes had issues that were critical or high priority that would be cycled between phases, or the severity would be changed, and it wasn't necessarily appropriate. Probably someone that was a bit tired changed it, scoped it down, whatever. But is this also intended to work with labels so that you sort of build your own homebrewed version of the artifact that you're having? So you have vulnerabilities, you have scan results from those vulnerabilities from those scans results. But is there also a plan to use the normal labels defined per project, or labels that are scoped, can't be changed, if then else? What are your thoughts? Because for me, it would have been useful to say, if a issue type label or incident type label is high or critical, it cannot be marked done unless you whatever, or you cannot descope or change the priority of an incident label issue once it has been set. If then blah, things like that, but sort of more like oriented to labels.
I don't know, Sam, if you had any plans on the label side. I'll say, at least from the vulnerability object side, right now we've purposely avoided adding labels just because we want to make sure that vulnerabilities are really for just sort of the triage and understanding what the specific problem is. And then you create issues and MRs from that and attach it to do the actual sort of like workflow and follow-up pieces. So I'll say no, not in the near future for the vulnerability side, but yeah, I don't know about Sam labels if you'd consider it in the policy piece.
Yeah, I mean, all of the vulnerability stuff, management stuff is really far out on our roadmap. So Matt, you would get to that way before we did at this point, because we're just, I mean, our category is brand new and we're just starting with project level DAST scheduled scan policies. So we're starting with like a super narrow slice, and like we have a long ways to go before we even start broaching vulnerability management type policies. So the editor is definitely flexible enough to allow what you're describing. It's just not anytime on the near term roadmap.
And Jason, I have a question about that. So you mentioned using some of those labels to sort of enforce what you can and can't do. Is there a way that you can actually put a label on something and, excuse me, not, like, I couldn't come in and remove one of your scope labels, for example, to get around the policy? I guess I thought labels were a lot more just sort of anybody could add them or remove them.
Yeah, so at least the way we use them in the team, and as far as I've seen in the security team, is pretty much only we set the label. So there are no external team members, like, yeah, from other teams, other departments that touch our labels. But sadly, due to the way the GitLab org, GitLab.com hierarchy is structured, many could, because the maintainer permissions sort of trickle down, and there are people outside of the security team and the security department and the SecAuto team that have maintainer permissions in our groups and projects, so they could change, they could make an issue that is a critical, make it a low, and if you're not paying attention, it's now a low, and we don't work on that. So we aren't as big, so that as to make it possible that that sort of thing gets lost in the noise, but abstracting away a bit, it could happen. Yeah. So that's why I mentioned, because one of the concerns I remember I used to discuss with people was, okay, how can we guarantee that the priorities of issues is not changed, that there's a paper trail, that we can react to it. So yeah, it's been on our minds. It's not a high priority thing, but it's been on our minds.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. I think that sort of starts falling outside of the direct purview of this team when you start talking about issue workflows and enforcing permissions and things you can and can't change about them. I will say that that's probably a better place to look at the vulnerability object. So our severities are we have a set, severity level for everything. We definitely have it in the plans to be able to override that. That would make a perfect rule right there to basically say either you can't or requires an approval to change a severity, so that you would at least have the tracking on the vulnerability piece itself. And that I think there was, actually I don't remember who opened it, but there was the idea of trying to map some of our labels to the severities when you create an issue. Right? Like if it's critical, map that automatically to a severity 1, for instance. There's nothing to prevent people from changing that, but I suppose you could kind of use that as another trigger to say, hey, these two things are out of sync. Get a little funky, but I think that's part of the problem is just GitLab. You can do kind of almost anything and anybody can access too much stuff. It's hard to lock down things that are really flexible, like the labels.
Yeah, another note on that. I mean, Matt Gonzalez in the compliance team is working to create immutable labels that basically are locked down. So again, I think we'll get there in the long run. It's just a pretty far ways out, but we're slowly working towards that.
Cool. Thanks.
Sam, that's a good point about his labels. I kind of forgot about where are those scoped to? Are the labels on the project level, or can they actually be on the issue level?
I think they're on the project level. So yeah, you would have to work within those constraints.
Gotcha. Interesting.
Awesome. Unless anybody wants to hang out and puzzle, do we have any other questions for today? I'm more than willing to hang out and puzzle. And Jason, you're more than welcome to join us at any time if you ever want to puzzle. I'll put the link there in the Zoom chat for you. We've constantly got a puzzle going. You can look in the threat management social channel if it changes. And thank you for joining us on our office hours. So we did update this to have an APAC and a MAF friendly schedule. So in 2 weeks, I think we still have this in 2 weeks because of the holiday. Yes, it'll be later in the day to accommodate for our APAC team members.
Cool.
All right, thank you everyone.